Welcome, nutritionradio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, University Nutrition Professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. Come on in. Lecture time. Hey, everybody. Today we've got some lecture time. We're going to draw directly from a lecture that was on fat loss and muscle gain. We'll probably only get through the beginnings of the fat loss portion. And it's important to know that you could pick this apart if you're an intermediate or advanced person. Some of this is introductory level stuff. It's simplified, and of course, I'm not fielding a lot of student questions here on air. And those do come up, and they get clarified and that sort of thing. So we're going to talk about fat loss in just a moment. What I want to do first is start sharing a couple of these great emails that I'm getting starting to come in. This first one is from Pete, longtime listener. He says, "Hey, Lonnie, I was filled with joy and a sense of gratefulness to discover Nutrition Radio and your return as our brilliant host from the Iron Radio community. The show feels like a talented extension of the news segment in Iron Radio, especially as it has often included nutrition science pieces from industry and research." That's really the idea, Pete. Just sidebar. This is the news segment, essentially, and it's something I can do quickly. Pete goes on, "You have one of the biggest hearts and greatest levels of commitment to honest information. We are all very fortunate to benefit from you. I hope you and your family are happy and healthy. Finally, I recommend potentially including some of the more science-focused folks in the industry to expand the visibility of Nutrition Radio. First, this could really amplify the audience who would benefit from your expertise and longitudinal knowledge. Second, you could make some episodes more positioned for folks to support via Patreon. This way, it's valuable for your time as well." Andrew Huberman at Stanford comes to mind, and Peter Attia is another that can be both engaging and help to remain evidence-based. Warmest, Pete. So, great advice, Pete. I'll look into those sorts of things. I definitely do want to explore some of the pure science or nutrition-specific, food-specific topics you can already tell in Nutrition Radio. As we still, dedicate a day each week to fitness and whatnot. But even the fitness stuff could be more broad than just the bodybuilding. You're going to get a big share of bodybuilder out of me, of course, because of my background. In any case, thanks very much, and let's go on to the lecture.
Fat loss and muscle gain is really only possible once we get the body composition lecture down. It makes a lot more sense. Instead of just talking about weight control, of course, we can talk about body compartments and how to manipulate them or partition nutrients into or out of different body compartments. So let's go to the first slide here, lecture preview. Some of this will be review from our energy balance lecture, but we're going to talk about factors that affect body composition. One of them is energy balance. I mean, calories do matter, but one of the themes I'd like to get across today is that calories in and calories out, they're not the whole picture. They're the beginning, not the end-all, be-all of weight control. And I'll show you what I mean. Number 2, macronutrient proportion. In other words, what ratio? You might have heard of 40-30-30, which is the, one popular diet, which is a very balanced kind of approach. It's 40%, one macronutrient, 30% of the other two. But the protein, carb, and fat content of the diet does matter. And so without just talking about just low carb or just low fat or what have you, know that even at a fixed calorie amount of, say, 2,000 calories per day, the macronutrient profile or proportion really does matter. And I'll show you some science references for that. Number 3 on this slide in the preview, dietary supplements, drugs, and other factors. We'll talk about that. And then finally, in the second half, we're going to talk about breaking fat loss plateaus or lean gain plateau. In other words, people will get stuck and they'll be like, I feel very stuck. I'm on a plateau. I can't progress any further. Why does that happen? And what can you do about it? So this is information that people will pay for if you end up being a professional and you work in weight management in any way. Also, over on the right side, there's a picture of a bodybuilder. Bodybuilders are a classic example of body composition, not just body weight. The gentleman here weighs well over 200 pounds, and yet he has almost no body fat. Obviously, drugs and other things come into the picture with some of these things, and that's what the box says. This is basically all of these kind of factors involve endocrinology, right, hormones, psychology, the sociology of it all, like how you interact with other people and, socioeconomic things. Can you afford a gym membership? Those sorts of things. And genetics. So let's move forward to the first part, energy balance, or sometimes just EBAL. Sometimes you'll hear energy balance called EBAL or nitrogen balance called NBAL, just because we get sick of saying energy balance all the time. So is this the end-all, be-all of weight management? That's certainly what the mass media would have you believe. I just read something this week from Time magazine that says, how long would you have to run to, jog away that cheeseburger? Well, that irks me terribly, and we're going to talk about that in the future here. But exercise is not just anti-eating. That just drives me nuts. As exercise physiologists, we know of all those adaptations that occur, whether you're a power athlete with the extra muscle mass or you're an endurance athlete with all those mitochondrial furnaces to burn fat. You are a fat-burning machine in many ways. You change physically from the subcellular level all the way up. So exercise changes you. It doesn't just drain calories. So although calories in and calories out are important, I mean, certainly you can't eat 5,000 calories a day and not gain any weight. But it's not the end-all be-all, as we'll see. So let's take a look here. The first slide, again, is a bit of a review. All these factors influence energy balance. There's an energy intake side on here and the energy output. And I won't dwell on this because we've already covered it. But again, there are social and economic things. There's hunger, appetite, which is more psychological. There's genetic issues. On the energy output side, we've got motivation and habits. We have to think about injuries when it comes to energy output. So several things there. And then another review here as far as thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says that energy, or matter in this case, can be neither created nor destroyed. It just changes form. So energy balance is important. Like I said, you can't, if you look at this slide, you can't put 5,000 calories in from the left there. And if everything leaving your body, your basal metabolic rate, the thermic effect of food, thermic effect of activity, if all those things are only 2,000 calories a day or 2,500, then you're simply putting in more than you're putting out. And so energy balance is so favorable that you will put on both fat and some lean tissue. Believe it or not, I've done some reviews of overfeeding studies, and people will put on 15, 20, 25% of the weight gain as lean tissue, depending on their genetics, even if they don't exercise. It's very interesting because there are certain things like leucine and the amino acid in proteins and whatnot that will turn on muscle building processes. Obviously, it's best when done after exercise. So you get the idea. When you gain weight, it's not just fat. And when you lose weight, it's not just fat. In any case. So the next slide's more review. Remember, it's hormones and muscle mass that really drive resting metabolic rate. That's our biggest energy output side. So things that affect resting metabolic rate have a huge impact on how much we change. So, for example, caffeine will raise your metabolic rate 5 or 10%. So when you're caffeinated, if that happens all the time, your metabolic rate is higher a lot of the time. Now, obviously, there's drawbacks to that because you might have sleeplessness or jitters or those sorts of things. But the point being is there are some things, like even protein has a higher thermic effect of food than carbs and fats, which is why it's common to many weight control diets. So anyway, hormones and muscle mass are very important there. And the same thing when we talk about hormones with resting metabolic rate, if you simply stop eating, as we'll see, that's a train wreck because then you start to have depressed thyroid function, your metabolism will slow down to adjust. So our metabolism is dynamic. It's not static. Many dietitians, they're so used to calculating the Harris-Benedict equation. If you remember, that's just height, weight, and age. That doesn't take into account your thyroid levels, and that's a driver of your metabolic rate. So your metabolism is dynamic. It will speed up and slow down if you overfeed or underfeed, and we need to remember that. And that always doesn't happen when you have a bachelor's prepared dietitian in a clinical setting, just doing a very simple equation and assuming that that's where your metabolism is. I mean, for example, you could have two guys that weigh 200 pounds. One of them is a bodybuilder. He has almost no body fat. He's lots of muscle. Another one is, very fat especially through the midsection. They're not going to have the same metabolic rate. So we need to be cautious in how we interpret those types of calculations. Okay, so next slide. How long to detect change? I said that we would get to this some more after our last lecture on body composition. And the energetics of fat loss is well known, as I mentioned in the body comp lecture. It's 3,500 calories per pound of fat. That's how much energy in the triglycerides that are stored in a pound of fat. So typically we put people on a 250 to 500 calorie deficit per day. That's very mild. And if you do the math, that, let's take the larger number, 500 calories per day over 7 days, that would be 500 times 7. That's 3,500 calories in a week. So you'd lose a pound of fat per week, in theory. Okay, so first of all, it's not going to be 100% fat loss. Secondly, your metabolism speeds up and slows down. In this case, it could slow down just a hair. So other things come into play. But I just want you to know the basic math. It's important because it is a good beginning for weight management. 500 calorie deficit every day, let's say out of 2,000 or 2,500 or 3,000 calorie usual intake. That's a realistic amount that's probably not going to crush someone's metabolic rate and send them into what I call starvation mode. So, hormones and training load are a big part of this, obviously. On the fat loss side, longer duration, moderate intensity really burns a lot of fat directly. Now, you can do high-intensity interval work, and that will burn fat, too. You'll tend to build mitochondria and structures and become a better fat burner in general. But if you want to burn fat directly, like literally the carbon dioxide on your breath used to be the carbon and fatty acid chains, that's medium intensity, so just below panting, for longer durations. And I like that in one sense because it's a less interfering approach if you're a team athlete. Since you don't cross certain hormonal thresholds and nervous system thresholds, you don't start dumping stress hormones and all that sort of thing when you're exercising at 55 or 60% of your max. So you could do a very fat-specific calorie drain, if you want to look at it like that, and not interfere with your team practice. If you did high-intensity interval work all the time outside of your team practices, I think you would overtrain. So I'm actually a fan of the tortoise approach. There's really the tortoise and the hare approach to fat loss, and they both work. The tortoise approach is almost every day, a full hour of mild intensity, like walk, jog kinds of things, and do it almost all the time. And the pro of that, of course, is that there's not much recovery necessary with a light walk, jog, especially if you're fit. The con is, gosh, you have to be compliant every single day, long duration, takes a long time, but it does work. I've seen people, and I myself have used this to get very lean in the past, down to 4 or 5% body fat, when you combine it with, a structured daily diet. But it really does help. The hair approach it's more efficient. You can burn more calories more quickly. You do burn glycogen calories while you're actually exercising. You're doing those sprints, bike sprints, running sprints. But you also become a better fat-burning machine in the long run, too. So the pro with the hair approach, the fast approach, like let's say you do 4, 5, or 6 30-second all-out sprints outside of your normal workouts or at the end of a normal workout. It's very efficient time-wise. You burn lots of calories very quickly. But, there's a recovery issue that could come up.
Okay, that's enough for that clip. If you are an experienced trainer or you're a physiologist in some way, you can see that I'm running fast and loose to make a point with a few things about endocrinology. Obviously, you could dig way beyond just thyroid to just T3. Right, a more bioactive form, triiodothyronine, or even things like deiodinases, enzymes involved in T3 and reverse T3 and all the things that happen during dieting. If you are a newbie and you're like, what? Don't worry about it. This is just for the more advanced people because this gets pretty nuanced. Even local changes in thyroid metabolism may happen, and it's not always systemic. You may not always see just from a forearm blood draw huge changes that you might expect in thyroid status. There's different things to look at here, too. I'm not going to get into TSH and everything else. Lastly, obviously, hormones other than thyroid are at play. Leptin, there's sympathetic nervous system hormones. Insulin is huge, sort of on the opposite side of a lot of things when it comes to fat loss, but insulin also being huge. So there's huge things going on here, but in general, you can expect reductions in thyroid status or function, reduced resting energy expenditure, and things of that nature. Even muscle tissue loss. Oftentimes when you look at resting energy expenditure and muscle by itself, that gets grossly exaggerated, like how many extra calories per day are burned by an additional pound of muscle. I recall research from Wolf that it's something like 6 to 13 extra kcal per additional pound of muscle. Now, if that's true in the reverse, that may or may not be easy to figure out. But in any case, lots of nuances here, but energy balance, hormones, and your overall body comp, they are good places to start to explore a fat loss regimen. Based on listener feedback, we may continue with another section of this lecture. We may jump around to other lectures, just trying to follow what's important to you all as you do your brief commute to work in the morning or whenever it is that you're listening to Nutrition Radio. We'll see you next time. The NutritionRadio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.